Her voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of weight that made men stop what they were doing. She stood with her back to the rough plank wall of the general store, one hand pressed low against her side, and when she spoke, it was as if the words had cost her the last of her breath. My ribs are already broken, no more pain. It was not a plea. It was not defiance. It was the sound of someone who had been worn thin enough to see through. He had just stepped out of the store, the creak of the screen door behind him, a sack of coffee beans in one hand. The sun caught on the dust clinging to his coat. His eyes found hers without searching, and something in his step changed, slower, heavier. He didn't look her over the way most men did. He looked at her like he was counting the places she might break if the wind caught her wrong. Her dress was the color of clay and frayed at the hem. She kept her weight tilted to one hip, a guarded stance that tried to hide the tremor in her breathing. There was no hat to shade her face, only the strands of dark hair that had slipped from the knot at the back of her head. A small, stubborn thing glinted in her grip, half hidden in the folds of her skirt, something she wouldn't put down even to catch herself. Behind them, a shopkeeper's mutter rose from the doorway, sharp and dismissive, "Ought not to linger here." A boy darted past with a tin pail, glancing back at her as if she were a caution whispered over supper. She didn't turn to see. She seemed to have learned the trick of not reacting. He stopped in front of her, setting the coffee down on the edge of the porch. His hand came forward, not sudden but steady, the kind of offer a person could refuse without shame. For a moment, she only looked at it, eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to read the cost behind the gesture. Then she took it, not because she believed in him, but because standing any longer might drop her to the dirt. He led her toward the hitch rail where a bay mare waited, the wagon hitched behind. The walk was slow, his stride matched to hers. She kept her free hand at her ribs, fingers spread as though holding them in place. No one stopped them, though a few heads turned and a few lips curled in whispers. He said nothing, and she matched his silence. When he helped her into the wagon seat, he did it as if she were made of thin glass. She tried not to flinch when his hand brushed her elbow, but her jaw tightened, betraying the pain that rippled through her. He climbed up beside her, gave the reins a light shake, and the mare stepped forward. The creak of the wheels filled the space between them. The road out of town stretched like a thin ribbon, dust lifting in low swirls behind. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't tell her. She sat with her shoulders drawn in, chin lifted just enough to keep from looking lost. Her gaze stayed on the horizon, though her eyes flicked once toward him when he adjusted the reins with a quiet competence that came from years of doing for himself. She had the look of someone who had walked too far without rest. Her boots were worn to softness, the leather at the toes split. The skin on her knuckles was scraped raw. And though she sat close enough for him to notice the tremble in her breath, she angled her body ever so slightly away, as though every inch of space mattered. They turned off the main road, the wagon dipping along a rutted track. His place came into view only when the fence line did. A small house with gray boards and a porch sagging just enough to speak of years, not neglect. A low barn sat to the side, its roof patched in darker tin. The smell of hay and wood smoke lingered faintly in the air, though no fire was lit. He stopped the wagon before the porch and stepped down, holding out a hand again. She hesitated longer this time, then let him guide her down, her breath catching as her boots met the packed earth. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. Instead, he opened the door and stepped back for her to pass, as though it were the most natural thing to bring a stranger home. Inside, the air was still, touched with the scent of worn pine and dry linens. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, quilt folded at the foot. A wooden chair stood beside it, its cane seat mended with twine. He gestured to it and she sat carefully, fingers pressed once more to her side. He moved about the small kitchen space, pouring water into a cup and setting it on the table near her. She nodded but didn't drink. From the corner, a faint creak sounded and two small faces peered in, one boy, one girl. The boy was a head taller, his hair in need of a trim, eyes quick and assessing. The girl's gaze lingered longer, wide and unblinking, until he motioned them away. Their footsteps faded, though she could still feel the girl's curiosity like a hand resting on her sleeve. He reached for a folded blanket on a shelf, setting it within her reach rather than draping it over her. Something about the choice, quiet, careful, softened the stiffness in her shoulders. She unfolded it slowly, spreading it over her lap as though testing the weight of trust. Hours passed in the muted rhythm of the house. She stayed in the chair, watching him work at a small table, mending a bit of leather. The scrape of his knife against the hide was steady, unhurried. She found herself matching her breathing to its pace, until the ache in her ribs seemed to ease just slightly. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "You'll rest here tonight." She nodded once, eyes lowered. There was no question of payment, no explanation given. Only the faint sound of the mare shifting in the barn outside. Later, when the children reappeared with bowls of stew, she accepted one from the girl's small hands. The warmth of the bowl seeped into her palms, and for the first time all day, her fingers unclenched. She ate slowly, the taste simple but grounding. The boy sat across from her, elbows on the table, watching with a cautious interest that seemed more protective than suspicious. After the meal, she moved to stand, but the motion pulled a breathless sound from her chest. His hand was there at her elbow again, steadying without gripping. She met his gaze briefly, long enough for him to see the line between pride and gratitude drawn tight in her eyes, then stepped back toward the bed. When she lay down, the blanket drawn to her chin, she turned her face toward the wall. The sound of his boots crossed the floor, then the soft creak of the porch boards as he stepped outside. She listened to the faint scrape of a chair being dragged, the sigh of wood as he sat. It was not the sound of someone keeping watch over a stranger out of duty. It was the sound of someone who had decided she was worth the trouble. Her fingers drifted to the small object in her skirt pocket. The smooth edge of the wooden brooch pressed into her palm, the carved lines worn by years of holding on. She had not let it out of her grasp for days, not since the moment she knew she had to leave everything else behind. Now, in the dim light of a home that was not hers, she found her grip loosening. Somewhere beyond the porch, a night bird called, the sound low and even. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to let the ache in her chest settle into something quieter. For the first time in too long, the silence around her did not feel like a threat. She could almost forget the eyes in town, the mutter at the store, the way her ribs still throbbed with each breath. Almost. But as her hand rested against the brooch, she knew forgetting was not the same as being free. Out on the porch, his chair creaked again and she pictured him there, boots planted, gaze steady on the dark beyond the fence. She wondered if he ever looked back at the town that had looked at her with nothing but judgment. And she wondered, with a cautious hope she didn't yet dare to name, whether he would still be sitting there come morning. The thought was enough to keep her awake a little longer, listening to the slow, deliberate weight of each sound he made, as if the night itself had decided to stand between her and whatever waited beyond the gate. The morning in the ranch house came without fanfare. She woke not because the light had reached her eyes, but because of a muted clink, the sound of a pot meeting a stove, the scrape of a spoon against tin. For a moment she forgot where she was, bracing for the shuffle of boots she had learned to fear. But the steps she heard were measured, unhurried, belonging to a man who moved like he had nothing to prove. The air in the small room carried a faint trace of wood smoke and oats. Her ribs ached in the familiar way, sharp at first, then settling into the dull, dragging pull that made every breath feel borrowed. She eased herself upright, keeping one hand pressed to her side. A blanket, heavier than the one she remembered from the night before, had been draped over her while she slept. She didn't remember him doing it. The door stood ajar. Beyond it, the low murmur of a child's voice, a softer one answering. She stepped into the narrow hall, barefoot on cool boards worn smooth by years of passing feet. In the kitchen he stood over a pot on the stove, steam curling around his face. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, forearms marked with old nicks from work. On the table 2 bowls were already set. A girl of about 5 sat in one of the chairs, legs swinging above the floor. Her hair was the color of wheat left in the field too long, fine and flyaway. She saw the woman in the doorway and stilled her legs, tilting her head as if memorizing every detail. "She's awake," the girl said, her voice carrying the unguarded directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to keep thoughts to herself. The man glanced over his shoulder. He didn't smile, but there was something like acknowledgement in the small dip of his chin. "Sit. There's plenty." She moved to the table slowly, lowering herself onto the chair opposite the girl. The bowl in front of her steamed gently, the smell simple and good, oats, a hint of molasses. She murmured a thank you, unsure if it was to him or to the fact that the food was warm. The girl slid a tin cup toward her. "It's milk. From yesterday." She said it with pride as though the age made it finer. The woman took it, fingers brushing the girl's briefly. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words came easier. The man sat last, after setting a smaller bowl at the edge of the table. From the doorway the boy she glimpsed last night appeared, hair rumpled, eyes sharper than his sister's. He said nothing as he took his seat, but his glance lingered on her face as though he were measuring the kind of person she might be. They ate without much talk. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the soft thud of the girl's heels tapping the chair leg. She took small bites, conscious of the ache in her side each time she leaned forward. When the bowls were empty, the man stood, gathering them into his hands. "You can rest," he said to her without looking up. "There's no rush here." Rest. It was a word she didn't quite know how to hold. In her experience, being still meant giving someone time to catch you. But the house was quiet in a way that did not feel like waiting for harm. She followed the girl out to the yard later, the sun low enough still to leave shadows long and thin. The child clambered onto the fence, balancing on the bottom rail, then hopping down to pick at the tall grass. She held out a small white flower. "It's a daisy. You can have it." The woman took it, tucking it carefully into the cuff of her sleeve as though it were something fragile enough to be kept. "It's beautiful," she said, and the girl grinned as if she'd just been told she had done something extraordinary. From the barn, the boy appeared carrying a bucket, the man behind him with a coiled rope over one shoulder. He called out to the boy to check the coop, his voice steady and even. The woman watched the way he moved, not quick, not slow, but certain. Every motion had a place, nothing wasted. She offered to help in the garden, more out of a need to stand upright than any desire to be useful. He didn't argue. He handed her a pair of gloves, the leather soft from use, and pointed to the row of beans. "Pull the weeds. Leave the rest." She knelt carefully, the ground cool beneath her knees, and began. The gloves were too large, but the fact that he'd given them to her at all sat warm in her chest. When he passed by to lead a horse toward the trough, he glanced once toward her hands, checking her work without words. By midday she was sweating, the ache in her ribs sharper again. She straightened, shading her eyes, and caught sight of two women walking along the fence line on their way to town. Their heads bent toward each other, whispers carrying just enough for her to catch her own name. Or not her name, she realized with a hollow twist in her chest. They didn't know it. Only a title they had given her. She kept her eyes on the dirt, fingers curling into the gloves. In the late afternoon she thought about leaving. Not in the way one plans a journey, but in the way a person rehearses absence. Picturing the porch without her, the table set for 3 instead of 4. It would be easier, she told herself. No whispers, no stares that made the space between her shoulder blades feel exposed. But when she walked back toward the house, the little girl was there, sitting on the fence again, legs swinging. In her lap, the daisy had been joined by 2 more. "I saved them," the girl said simply. "For you." Her throat tightened. She took the flowers, nodding, the idea of leaving dissolving under the weight of such a small, unguarded gift. That evening, the man sat on the porch, a worn chair angled toward the yard. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping out to join him, lowering herself into the other chair. They didn't speak. The sun dropped low, painting the fields in amber. The quiet between them was not the absence of words but the presence of something steadier, an understanding that neither would demand more than the other could give. Inside, the children's laughter carried from the kitchen, light and quick. The boy had found a beetle and was showing his sister how it curled into itself. The woman watched them, a faint smile touching her mouth before she turned back to the porch. The man's gaze was on the horizon, but she could feel his attention brush her like a hand that didn't need to touch to be felt. She thought of the flowers on the table inside, of the gloves in the garden, of the bowl of oats set before her that morning. None of it was grand. All of it was more than she had been given in a long time. She stayed out there until the stars began to show, the air cooling just enough to raise the hairs on her arms. When she finally rose, she left the porch without saying good night, trusting he would understand. In her small room, she set the daisies in a chipped mug with water, placing them on the windowsill. She lay down with her back to the wall, listening to the creak of the porch boards as he shifted his chair. The sound was steady, like a heartbeat you didn't realize you'd been measuring yourself against until it was there. Somewhere in the stillness between his movements and the faint stirrings of the night outside, she felt the first thread of something fragile take hold. Something that might, given time, be strong enough to stay. The first sound of the morning was not the clink of a pot but a sharp peal of laughter from the kitchen. Light, sudden, and so unguarded it startled her where she sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her shawl tight. She stepped into the hallway, slow enough that the ache in her ribs didn't bite too hard, and found the source. The boy sat at the table, a spoon balanced awkwardly in one hand, pretending it was so heavy he could barely lift it. His sister clapped her hands in delight at the performance, giggling so much her milk sloshed in its cup. The woman paused in the doorway, unsure if she was allowed into that kind of sound. But then the boy glanced at her, a flicker of mischief still in his eyes, and she couldn't stop the smallest laugh from escaping her lips. It was quick, almost fragile, but real enough that the room shifted around it. The man stood at the stove, turning toward the sound. His eyes caught hers for a moment before he looked back to the pan. He didn't smile outright, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that seemed easier. When she took her place at the table, the boy passed her a plate without being told. She accepted it with a nod, feeling the weight of the small change. Yesterday, he had looked at her like she was an answer to a question he wasn't sure he wanted. Today there was no question, only the quiet beginning of familiarity. The morning passed without rush. He hitched the mare to the wagon for a trip to the feed store, and she found herself trailing the children into the yard. The girl carried a small basket and insisted they search the garden for anything worth bringing inside. They found 2 carrots, both crooked and dirt-clumped, and a sprig of parsley that had somehow survived the frost. The girl handed them over like treasures. When the man returned, he found her on the porch steps with the children at her side. He gave the faintest lift of his chin toward the barn, and she followed him without asking why. Inside, he set a length of canvas on a bench and began sorting tools. She lingered near the doorway, watching him move with the same calm efficiency she had seen in the yard. "You sew?" he asked, his voice even. She blinked, surprised. "I can mend." He handed her a tear-worn saddle blanket. "Stitch it slow. The thread's coarse." She settled on the bench, threading the needle with fingers that remembered the motion even if they had not held a needle in months. The stitches came out neat, though her ribs protested each time she bent forward. He worked beside her, replacing a worn bridle strap, neither of them filling the air with words. The blanket was nearly mended when a gust of wind swept through the open door, lifting the edge of her skirt. Something small and carved slipped free from her pocket, clattering to the floor. She froze. He bent to pick it up before she could reach it. A wooden brooch, the lines worn smooth, the faint outline of a bird etched into its surface. His fingers turned it once, then he placed it back in her palm without asking a thing. She closed her hand around it, her throat tight. "My brother made it," she said finally, the words low. "When we were children." He didn't press for more. Only nodded once, as though she had told him something worth keeping. Later, she found herself telling the children a story about that same brother, how he had once tried to teach her to skip stones and ended up falling into the creek. The girl giggled at the image and even the boy's mouth curved. She realized too late that her voice had softened while telling it, losing the brittle edge it carried in town. The thaw was not a thing she recognized in the moment. It came in pieces. A tin cup passed without asking, the way the boy began leaving the smaller chores for her as though assuming she would want to help, the man setting a chair for her near the stove in the evenings without remark. But town had its own memory. At the feed store 2 days later, she walked in with the man to fetch seed. A man near the counter, one she didn't know, let his eyes drag over her before speaking loud enough for all to hear. "Didn't think you'd take in strays," he said to the rancher. "Thought you kept your place clean." She felt the heat climb her neck, her ribs seeming to pulse with each word. She turned to leave, but the man stepped between her and the voice, his back a wall. "We're here for seed," he said, quiet but with a weight that left no room for reply. And just like that, the other man looked away. They left without further words. In the wagon on the way home, she kept her gaze forward, but something in her chest shifted. Not just gratitude, but a recognition that he had not defended her with noise or fists, only the kind of presence that made such things unnecessary. That night, she lingered by the window in her room, watching him in the yard as he untied the mare. The children ran ahead of him toward the porch, their voices carrying in the cooling air. He said something she couldn't hear, and they laughed, the sound rising toward her like something light enough to keep. She touched her ribs, almost without thinking. They still hurt, but not the way they had when she first stood outside the general store. The ache was no longer only from harm, it was from the slow, careful way something was being rebuilt beneath the break. The days stretched into a rhythm she did not want to admit she liked. In the mornings, the girl would knock on her door with a small offering, a button she had found, a scrap of ribbon, a feather. In return, the woman began to braid the girl's hair before breakfast, fingers deft even when her own body was slow. The boy was harder to read. He didn't seek her out, but when they were both in the yard, he would point out the best wood for kindling or leave the gate unlatched so she could follow him into the pasture. One afternoon she found him near the chicken coop, holding an egg cupped in both hands. "It's warm still," he said, offering it like something sacred. She took it carefully, feeling the heat of life against her palm, and for a moment neither spoke. Inside, the man was at the table working over a ledger. She set the egg in a small bowl and began peeling potatoes without asking if she should. He glanced up once, then went back to his figures, but she felt his gaze return now and again, as if checking to see if she was still there. It was in these quiet, almost invisible acts that the thaw deepened, the kind no one would notice unless they'd been frozen first. But the world beyond the fence did not forget its cruelties. At the well in town, she overheard two women speaking in tones that carried more than they should. "Won't last," one said. "Men like him come to their senses." She carried the bucket back without letting the water spill. But her chest felt hollow. She told herself she would leave soon before the whispers reached the children. Yet that evening as she walked up the path, the little girl was waiting on the fence again, legs swinging, holding a daisy. "It's for you," she said, smiling as if no other truth existed. And in that moment, leaving seemed like the wrong kind of survival. That night, she found herself sitting by the hearth while the man mended a bridle. The children played on the floor with carved wooden animals, their voices weaving in and out of the fire's crackle. She didn't speak, but the warmth from the flames and the weight of the moment made her feel as though she were part of the room, not just passing through it. When the children went to bed, the man set his work aside. "Cold tomorrow," he said, not as a warning but as a simple fact. She nodded, tucking her shawl tighter, and for the first time she wished the evening would stretch longer. In her room, she opened her hand and looked at the brooch. The bird's wings were smooth, nearly flat from years of holding, the edges softened. She placed it on the small table by her bed instead of hiding it away, a choice so small it might have gone unnoticed, except that when she glanced toward the doorway she saw him there, leaning briefly on the frame before moving on without a word. She lay down, the brooch catching the faint light from the window, and thought of the steady way he had stood in the feed store, the careful return of the brooch to her hand, the quiet nods that had passed for conversation. None of it felt like rescue. It felt like a man saying, in all the ways he knew how, that she was not a burden. It was enough to keep her awake, wondering what tomorrow might bring and what it would mean if she decided to stay. The knock came just after midday, when the light was beginning to shift through the kitchen window, turning the worn boards pale and the air still. She had been rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes, sleeves rolled past her elbows, when the sound struck, 3 hard raps against the door, carrying the kind of rhythm that announced itself as a claim, not a visit. He was at the table with the ledger, pen in hand. At the first knock his head lifted. At the second the pen was set down. By the third he was on his feet, moving toward the door with a measured pace that didn't fool her. She dried her hands quickly, the cloth twisting in her grip, and stepped into the main room as he opened it. A man stood framed in the doorway, his coat too fine for ranch work, boots clean, eyes sharp with the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you're owed something. Behind him 2 others waited, their shadows cutting long into the yard. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "She's here," he said, not looking at the rancher but at her, his gaze sliding over the room until it found her. "You've got something belongs to me." Her breath snagged, but she stood where she was. The rancher's body shifted subtly, not blocking her completely, but enough to make the doorway feel narrower. "You've got the wrong place," he said, voice low and flat. The man's smile widened. "I don't." "She owes a debt. And debts don't vanish just because you find yourself a kind fool to hide behind." She wanted to speak, to say it wasn't true, or that if it was, it wasn't in the way he meant, but the words dried in her throat. She'd learned that anything said in front of men like him would be twisted until it was theirs. The rancher's hand rested against the edge of the door, steady. "You said your piece. Now you can leave." The man's gaze flicked between them, weighing something. Then he tipped his hat with a mock politeness that stung worse than a slap. "We'll be back. And you'll wish you'd handed her over when you had the chance." When the door shut, the air in the room felt heavier. She could hear the sound of the children in the back room, their play muffled, unaware. Her hands shook as she smoothed the front of her dress. "He'll come back," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, the stillness in him not absence but thought. "Then I'll still be here." That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep, every whisper of wind like a voice at the window. When she woke from a dream, one where hands pulled her back into a darkness she knew too well, she found him sitting in the chair by the door, boots planted, hat in his lap. "You don't have to," she began, but he cut her off with a small shake of his head. "Just in case." She didn't thank him, though the words sat at the edge of her mouth. Instead, she lay back down, the sight of him there anchoring her more than the walls themselves. The next morning, the little girl climbed onto her bed before she could get up. "I told Uncle you're good," she whispered, like it was a secret that could tip the world one way or the other. She smoothed the woman's hair with a small, clumsy hand. "He already knows." It should have made her smile. Instead, it lodged under her ribs like something too sharp to swallow. She had spent years being named things she wasn't, Liar, burden, mistake. To be called good felt heavier than any insult, because it was something she wasn't sure she could hold. That afternoon she found herself on the porch, mending a tear in the girl's dress. The rancher was in the yard, splitting logs, each strike of the axe precise. She thought about the man at the door, the look in his eyes when he said he'd be back. She knew the kind of harm that could ride on a promise like that. When the sun dipped, she went inside to start the stew. He joined her later, washing the dirt from his hands at the basin. They moved around each other in the small kitchen without bumping, a quiet rhythm forming. She wanted to tell him about the debt, not because she believed she owed it, but because she needed him to know the shape of the trouble that might come. The words pushed against her teeth, but before she could speak, the boy burst in from the yard, breathless. Riders, coming fast. Her stomach dropped. They reached the door at the same time. Dust rose beyond the fence line, 3 figures cutting toward the house. He stepped out onto the porch, his stance calm but rooted. She stayed just behind him, the children pressed close to her sides. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, the same man from before at their head. His smile was gone this time. I told you we'd be back. The rancher didn't move. And I told you she stays. This isn't your fight, the man said. The rancher's voice didn't rise. It is now. The man's gaze shifted past him, settling on her. You really think hiding here will save you? He can't keep you from what you owe. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I don't owe you. His jaw tightened. We'll see about that. He jerked his reins and the riders turned, dust swallowing them as quickly as it had brought them. The silence after was heavier than the threat. She realized her hands were gripping the children's shoulders so tightly that they both squirmed. She let go, smoothing their hair as if that could erase it. Inside, the rancher poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising between them. He'll try again, she said. Then we'll be ready. You don't even know. She stopped herself, the words too close to breaking. I know enough, he said. She looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor still in them. You're going to get hurt because of me. He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with a quiet certainty that made the air shift. Some things are worth it. That night, the candle on the table burned low, its flame leaning in the draft. They sat across from each other, bowls empty between them. She reached for the spoon at the same time he did, their hands brushing. Neither pulled away. It was not a declaration, but something steadier, like the slow settling of a foundation after the storm has passed, knowing another might still come. Later, in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed with the wooden brooch in her palm. The bird's wings caught the flicker of the candlelight, shadow and shine shifting with the movement of her fingers. She thought of her brother carving it, the way he had said it would keep her safe. She had stopped believing that long ago. But as she set it on the table beside her bed, she realized she was no longer holding it like a shield. Out in the main room, the sound of his boots moved once across the floor, then stilled. She lay back, eyes open to the dark, the space between them filled with the quiet knowledge that the next knock on the door would not be answered by her alone. The day they came back began like any other, without warning in the sky or a shadow across the door. She had risen early, drawn by the faint scent of coffee, and found him already outside, repairing the latch on the barn. The children were chasing each other between the fence posts, laughter stitching the air together in loose threads. For a moment, she let herself believe that this was the way it could stay, quiet, ordinary, unbroken. But the sound came before the sight. Hooves, not at a gallop but at the measured, deliberate pace of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. She froze on the porch steps, hands gripping the worn rail, eyes tracking the dust that began to gather at the far end of the fence line. He straightened from his work, hammer hanging from one hand. The boy stopped mid-run, sensing the change before the first riders came into view. The girl slipped behind her skirt without being told. 3 of them again. The man at the front was the same one who had knocked on the door before, his fine coat catching the light, his mouth curved into that thin line that wasn't a smile. The 2 behind him were broader, heavier in the saddle, their eyes sweeping over the yard as though they were already counting what would be taken. The rancher stepped forward, placing himself between them and the porch. He didn't raise his voice. You've had your say. You can ride on. The man laughed once, sharp and dry. We're past talking. His gaze shifted to her, lingering in a way that made her ribs ache as if struck. You can come now or you can be dragged. Makes no difference to me. She felt the girl's small fingers twist into the fabric at her side. The boy had moved to stand beside his uncle, his jaw set in a line too old for his years. The rancher's voice was steady. She stays. The man's eyes narrowed. You think standing there makes her yours? She stepped down off the porch before she could think, the movement pulling all eyes to her. I'm not his, she said, her voice low but carrying. But I'm not yours either. This is my home. For a beat, no one moved. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. The man on the horse looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't believe she knew. From the road, a voice called out. Everything all right here? It was the blacksmith from town, reins in one hand, his cart half loaded with tools. Behind him, the baker's boy had stopped his own wagon, eyes darting between the riders and the porch. One by one, more faces appeared along the fence line, people who had kept their distance before, but who now seemed unwilling to look away. The man on the horse sneered, but something in his posture shifted. This isn't over, he said, jerking his reins. His companions turned with him, dust rising behind them as they rode back the way they came. When the sound of hooves faded, the blacksmith tipped his head to the rancher. If they trouble you again, you send word. The baker's boy nodded, awkward but earnest. A woman she barely knew left a small cloth bundle on the fence post. Later she would find it was filled with biscuits, still warm. The yard emptied slowly, the quiet returning in pieces. She stood on the porch steps, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into her bones. He was still in the yard, eyes following the last of the dust. When he looked back at her, it wasn't with triumph but with something quieter, heavier, like a man taking stock of what had almost been lost. Inside, the children chattered about how the riders had turned away, each telling it as though they'd been the one to send them off. She let their voices run together, the sound a balm against the rawness in her chest. That evening she found him at the mantel, his hand resting on the shelf. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and drew out the wooden brooch. She placed it there beside his hand, the carved bird catching the glow from the fire. His fingers brushed the edge of it, then withdrew. He didn't ask why she had left it there, and she didn't explain. They stood together in the soft light, the silence between them holding more than words could. Later, as they sat at the table with the children, she caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Not the way a man looks when he wants to possess something, but the way he looks when he recognizes it as already part of his life. The stew was simple, the bread plain, but the air at the table was warmer than it had been before. The girl leaned against her side, drifting toward sleep, while the boy recounted the day with the unshakable pride of someone who had stood his ground. When the dishes were cleared and the children sent to bed, she lingered by the hearth. The flames had burned low, the wood settling into embers. He joined her there, leaning one shoulder against the wall. They'll think twice before coming back, he said quietly. She shook her head. Men like that don't stop because they're told to. They stop when there's no reason left to try. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then we give them no reason. She met his gaze, holding it longer than she had before. There was no need to thank him, not for standing in the yard, not for sitting in the chair by her door, not for letting her stay without ever asking for anything in return. Gratitude felt too small for what had been built here, brick by brick, kindness by kindness. The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks upward. She looked at the brooch on the mantel, the bird seeming to take flight in the shifting light. It wasn't the mending of ribs that saved me, she said almost to herself. It was the mornings. The oatmeal on the table. The way you stayed. He didn't answer, but the quiet between them deepened, settling into something that felt like a promise. She turned back to the fire, letting the heat touch her face, and thought of the road that had brought her here, the miles walked, the doors closed, the voices that had tried to name her. They didn't matter now, not in the way they once had. The house, the hearth, the steady shadow of the man beside her. This was what remained. In the next room, the girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring something she couldn't make out. The boy's breathing was slow, even. Outside, the night lay over the land in a wide, unbroken stretch. She reached up and touched the brooch once, just enough to feel the familiar lines beneath her fingers, then let her hand fall. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to keep it close. It could rest there in plain sight because so could she.